Good evening. We welcome you to tonight's debate sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Lackawanna County. My name is Diana Daigie, our League's current president. We want to thank the University of Scranton Political Science Department for co-sponsoring tonight's debate. A little bit about the League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters is nonpartisan, which means we do not support or oppose any political party or candidate. The mission of the League is to promote political responsibility through the informed and active participation by citizens in their government. We encourage you to join the League of Women Voters. Membership information can be found in your program, or you can go to our website. The web address is also printed in your program, and that's www.lwvlackawanna.org. Please support our work by making a donation on your way out. We would greatly appreciate this. Donations help us to cover costs, including taping, such as tonight, so that the debates can be viewed by a wider audience. Anne and Cindy will be at the back of the room as you depart, and we would greatly appreciate any donation you could give us. ECTV is taping tonight's debate. This is not a live broadcast. The taped debate will be aired on Comcast 19 local TV. So please check the ECTV schedule, which can be found also on our website. This taped debate will also be available on YouTube via links from our website. If you reside in the 114th District, we held and taped a debate last evening about some upcoming events. Of course, the most important upcoming event is Election Day, Tuesday, November 4th, so don't forget to vote. Immediately following the 22nd senatorial debate this evening at 8:15 will be the debate between the candidates for the 113th Legislative District. And if you reside in the 117th Legislative District, please join us for a debate this coming Tuesday, the 28th, at Keystone College. Information is in your program. And then one more upcoming event. We will be, again, doing live election returns on ECTV as the polls are about to close and after they close, broadcast from ECTV. A few procedural items for everyone in the audience. Please turn off and silence your phones and any other devices. Please be aware of our policy that no person, candidate, or political group is allowed to use or edit any media from a League of Women Voters event for campaign purposes. Any use of the media requires the express written approval of the League of Women Voters. No excerpts or sound bites may be taken from tonight's debate. So tonight's debate is between the candidates for the 22nd Senatorial District. Dr. Jean Harris will serve as our moderator. She will introduce the candidates in a moment. Dr. Jean Harris is professor in the Political Science Department at the University of Scranton. She's currently on the board of the League of Women Voters of Lackawanna County, and she is a past president of our league. Jean, thank you very much.
Thank you, Diana. Good evening. As Diana said, the League of Women Voters believes that democratic government depends on the informed and active participation of its citizens. Therefore, the League works to foster an educated citizenry and to inspire citizens to participate in politics. Sponsoring debates like this evening's debate helps the League to accomplish these goals. Tonight's debate will be approximately 60 minutes in length. Both candidates will answer the same set of questions. No questions were given to either candidate prior to this evening's event. All questions will have a 90-second response time. Each candidate will be allowed up to 3 rebuttals in total during the hour-long debate, each rebuttal no more than 1 minute, and that's at the candidate's discretions. There will be no opening statement. Candidates will be allowed a 2-minute closing statement, and we ask that you hold all applause until the end of your candidate's closing statement. We did a flip of the coin, and so When we get started with the questions, Mr. Blake will answer first. I will now introduce the candidates competing for the 22nd Senatorial District seat, which encompasses the Lackawanna County, part of Luzerne County, and part of Monroe County. First, Mr. Joe Albert is running as a Republican. He is a resident of Scranton. Mr. Albert received a Bachelor of Business Administration from the University of Miami in Florida. He graduated from Purdue University's Life of Insurance Marketing Institute, from the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, and the National Defense University. He also attended the Air War College. Mr. Albert worked in the insurance industry. He's a retired military officer. He is a former administrative assistant to U.S. Congressman Claude Pepper and a deputy mayor of Miami, Florida. Currently, he's a business owner, community leader, member or president of numerous nonprofit civic boards, veteran and fraternal organizations. Mr. Blake, John Blake, is running as a Democrat. Mr. Blake is a resident of Archbald, Pennsylvania. He received an MBA in finance from the University of Scranton, executive education and public management from Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government, an MSW from Marywood College, and a BA in sociology from Villanova University. He has served in the Pennsylvania State Senate since 2011. Formerly, he served as an adjunct instructor in economics at the Kania School of Management at the University of Scranton, Executive Deputy Secretary for Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development, Director of the Northeast Regional Office in Scranton during the Rendell administration, Vice President for PNC Bank. He also served over 10 years as Executive Director of the Lackawanna County Redevelopment Authority and served as Executive Director of Lackawanna County's Tourism Promotion Agency. So as I said, we'll begin the questioning. Mr. Blake will answer the first question first, and then for the second question, Mr. Albert will answer first, and we'll rotate in that order. So gentlemen, the first question. And please, if I speak too quickly or you can't hear me, ask me to slow down or repeat the question. The first question deals with ethics. Can you describe what it means to be a public servant who behaves ethically? And is there a difference between what is legal and what is ethical? Mr. Blake, you're first.
Thank you, Dr. Harris, and thank you to the League for hosting this debate tonight. I basically take great pride in the fact that my service in the Senate is done with an ethical imperative. There are things that are legal that may in fact not be determined to be ethical. I think there is a difference sometimes, but I think the moral code that we have and the standard to which we are held as public officials ought to be and is for me very, very high. There should be no compromise of the public trust. There should be complete transparency. There should be no conflict of interest. There should be no undue influence in steering things that otherwise should be objective and transparent and accountable. And again, I think that the issue is oftentimes unethical behavior when it is revealed often results in additional legal action or legislative action in order to correct the wrong. So there is a difference, but I take great pride in the ethical imperative of my work, and I take very seriously the public trust.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. Mr. Albert, the same question to you.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. Thank the League of Women Voters. I thank Senator Blake for joining us. In any election, I believe integrity is the issue. Ethics follows integrity. When you're representing the public's interest, you're not representing the special interest. You're supposed to be representing the interest of the people who elected you to your best ability. And without hesitation, we have had in the past perhaps a failure by elected officials across the board. Unethical behavior is not paramount to or owned by any one party. Both parties participate. And people have to understand that when they go to vote. They have to vote and look at an entire record of an individual, not just a party. The problem, I believe, in northeastern Pennsylvania is that too long we have just voted political parties. And in that respect, we have an opportunity to vote for the individual. Thank you.
Thank you. Please hold your applause until the end of the evening after the closing statements. Thank you. The second question. Over the past decade, Pennsylvania government has experienced numerous government scandals, many tied to campaign contributions and gifts. Recent polls show that the overwhelming majority of Pennsylvanians support banning lobbyists and others who seek to influence public policymakers, ban them from giving to government officials gifts, hospitality, entertainment, and travel expenses. Currently, Pennsylvania is one of the few states, one of only 10 states, that has no limits on such gifts. So the question is, what is your position on government officials receiving gifts? Should gifts be banned, limited, or regulated in some other way? And Mr. Albert, you're first to answer this question.
I think this goes back to your original question with regard to ethics and integrity. It's not a matter of whether or not an individual receives a gift. He certainly should report a gift. Should there be limits on valuations of gifts? Absolutely. It's more important, however, for those who are giving the gifts to make it perfectly clear why they're giving the gift. And that's the underlying problem with elected officials and even appointed officials in accepting gratuities. There must be an accountability. As Senator Blake pointed out, there must be transparency. That is the most important issue because, in my opinion, people have lost respect for their government, for their elected officials. And it's unfortunate, and people such as myself and Mr. Blake are doing our best to try to restore it.
Thank you. Mr. Blake?
Yes, I have to echo some of the comments of my opponent here because we probably agree on this point. The issue of gifts, it's very, very uncomfortable in office. I think the straight answer to your question is there should be very, very severe restrictions on gifts. I'm not sure that an outright ban is possible or enforceable because of some of just the human interaction. But I would tell you that they should be very severely restricted, and I would tell you that I have supported legislation that would create a greater transparency on this issue of lobbyists, on this issue of campaign finance. Senator Costa, the Democratic leader, has a bill that would really try to stop the Wild West in Pennsylvania with respect to campaign finance. But the issues clearly, and my opponent mentioned this, has to do with the public trust and the accountability and the transparency. We simply have an obligation to be more open about our conduct of business in government, and I take great pride in the transparency I've demonstrated over the past 4 years.
Thank you. The third question deals with the minimum wage, and Mr. Blake will answer this first. 23 states, including all of Pennsylvania's neighboring states, have raised the minimum wage in recent years. Pennsylvania's minimum wage remains at $7.25 an hour. The Times Tribune reported recently that more than 75,000 people in Northeast Pennsylvania, or about 20% of the workforce, labor for a minimum wage, and that minimum wage has an inflation-adjusted value, making it roughly 23% lower in real dollars than it was in 1968. The question is, for the candidates, what is your position on increasing the state's minimum wage? Mr. Blake.
I support an increase in the minimum wage. No one should work 40 hours a week and be below the federal poverty level. I think this is an insult to human dignity. The fact of the matter is that the statistics and the research show that improving the spending power at the lowest end of our economic strata actually improves the economy, creates the opportunity for economic growth, quite simply because people have more disposable income to meet basic needs, and will obviously use that in the local economy. So I support the increase in the minimum wage, and I've been on the record for 4 years in that regard.
Thank you. Mr. Albert?
As Senator Blake has pointed out, it is relatively unreasonable to expect the current minimum wage that is offered to provide for a family to live on. The minimum wage should be increased. However, the public must understand that those who are receiving are working for their money. It's unfortunate that it's easier to live off the public dole than to work for a living. And sometimes people have to work 2, 3, 4 jobs in order to just survive. One example is to put more money back in an individual's pocket. For example, Senate Bill 76, which calls for the elimination of the school property tax. People cannot survive, as Senator Blake pointed out, on the minimum wage. That must be increased, but the government must do their part also.
Thank you. Shifting a little bit, this time we're going to look at the salaries for folks working in the state legislature. In November 2013, Pennsylvania state legislators saw their 18th annual 3% pay increase in the form of a COLA, a cost of living increase. Pennsylvania legislators' base salary has risen from $47,000 in 1995 to $84,012 in 2014. The COLA will raise retirement pensions of state legislators, the governor and his staff, as well as state judges, regardless of whether they later return all or part of the COLA bump to the state or a charity via personal check, as some do. During a time of recession and unemployment, the average Pennsylvanian has not seen such a pay increase. Measures to reverse the automatic pay rule in the legislature have not been acted upon. Please explain why you would or would not support the establishment of a nonpartisan, independent compensation commission to determine any future salary increases for state legislators and public officials. And Mr. Albert will answer this first.
I certainly believe that it would be in the best interest of the public to have an independent, nonpartisan commission study this particular subject. However, how are you going to find such a committee? It's going to be created by the executive branch or the legislative branch. What's its role going to be? Is it going to have a lifespan? Is it going to have a sunset clause? It's an area that certainly deserves looking into, studying, and probably legislation.
Thank you. Mr. Blake?
The issue of the COLA has been a vexing one for me. I actually supported a bill by, I believe it's Senator Rob Teplitz, to abolish them. I'd like that to get to the governor's desk. We really ought not have it. I encounter retired teachers who have been living on the same pension for 20 years and they've not seen a COLA. And Dr. Harris, your comments on this are well noted, that people have not seen those kinds of increases in the private sector. So I'd like to see it go away. I certainly would agree that we can achieve some reform through an independent commission on these issues of compensation. I would certainly support the establishment of such a commission, and I believe it would create the transparency and the accountability that the citizens in Pennsylvania deserve.
Thank you. We're going to begin to talk a little bit about budget and tax issues. A drive to replace school property taxes with a combination of a higher state sales tax and state income tax continues. House Senate Bill 76 is one such proposal, which calls for raising the state personal income tax by 1.27%, increasing the state sales tax by 1%, imposing the sales tax on some previously untaxed items, and abolishing the authority of school boards to levy property taxes. So the question is, which of these proposals do you support, which do you oppose, and please explain your support and your opposition. And this time we have Mr. Blake answering first.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. So I need to be on the record here that as the Senate Chairman, Minority Chairman of Finance, I had the ability to cast a vote that would have defeated Senate Bill 76. I instead voted affirmative to move the bill out of committee. I did that for one reason, and one reason only, because I wanted the debate to continue, the civic debate about a flawed property tax system, an obsolete system that is punitive to seniors and young families starting out. But I think it's very, very important for me to be candid with you about what you're not hearing about Senate Bill 76. What you're not hearing about Senate Bill 76 is that the Independent Fiscal Office indicates that it will not adequately raise sufficient funds to fund public education, and then in year 3 we'd be $1.5 billion short. The second thing you're not hearing much about is that 30% of local property taxes are not paid by residences. They are paid by corporations. So if Senate Bill 76 became law, ExxonMobil no longer pays property taxes. The third thing you're not hearing about Senate Bill 76 is that it claims that it will eliminate property taxes. But there are 500 school districts in the Commonwealth right now that have a total of $25 billion in debt. That debt is secured by future property taxes. So if Senate Bill 76 became law tomorrow, your income tax would go up 41%, your sales tax would go up 1%, you'd pay sales tax on things you've never paid sales tax on before in your life, including legal services, accounting services, daycare services, funeral services, anything that you can think of. And by the way, you would continue to get a property tax bill until the debt of your school district was resolved. That's the reason I have a problem with that solution set.
Thank you. And now we'll turn to Mr. Albert.
I think this is the premier issue my opponent and I disagree on. I fully support Senate Bill 76 and believe it should have been passed. The offset revenue would be simply a 1% increase in the state sales tax. We're going from 6% to 7%. And let's remember that the original sales tax put into effect in 1962 was for the benefit of education. The 1% increase in the personal income tax is really not going to affect too many people. Secondly, I think it's important to realize that specifically in the 22nd Senatorial District, this is the grayest district in the Commonwealth. We have senior citizens who have lived in their homes 20, 30, 40 years, barely holding on because they cannot afford their school property taxes. And by eliminating the school property tax, you're doing two things. One, you're allowing those people to remain in their homes and own them. And second, you're putting an incentive into the people's pocket by removing that property tax, putting it into their own pocket, and letting them spend it. You're taking away the school board's permission to tax them unilaterally.
Thank you. Did you want to use one of your rebuttals?
If I could, please.
Yes.
I need to explain that I don't disagree with my opponent on the issue of this punitive system, especially on seniors. But we have not been adequately funding public education from Harrisburg. We're only at about 34% in terms of the state share of funding of public education, which means 2/3 of the cost are being borne by the local tax base, which is upside down in my opinion. We really do need, in my opinion, to fund it greater so that the local tax base is not carrying such a disproportionate burden. I also believe that we need to provide additional support for those most vulnerable to the high property taxes, which would be the seniors in my district, and I will advance policies to provide that relief.
May I have a opportunity?
Yes.
I strongly disagree with my opponent on that because the basic opposition to Senate Bill 76 are special interests. If you take a look at those funding the opposition, you have two distinct special interest groups, school boards and state teachers. They're afraid they're going to lose something. The school boards will lose something. They'll lose their power to tax behind closed doors. If they don't think the amount of funds that they're receiving is enough, they will have to go back to you, the taxpayer, and ask permission to increase a personal income tax on you.
Thank you. Question number 6, and we'll start with Mr. Albert on this one. School districts around the state are cutting staff and educational services in order to afford the high pension contribution rates to the Pennsylvania Public School Employee Retirement System, an obligation created by the legislature. The shortfall is estimated at $50 billion across the state. The question is, how should the legislature address this growing pension problem? Mr. Albert.
I think one of the most serious problems facing the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is the pension crisis among state employees and school teachers. And we need to even talk about local municipality pension problems, such as in Scranton with the fire and police. I think what has to be done, perhaps renegotiate union contracts because pensions are provided under contracts negotiated by unions and governments, and perhaps consider there are alternatives. Currently, you have what's called a defined benefit pension plan. In the insurance industry, that used to be the favorite. It was best for the agents, they got the best commission. However, they found out there are better programs available. For example, the 401k plan. Those employees who are currently retired wouldn't be affected. Those employees who are currently fully vested wouldn't be affected at all. The transition would be with new employees coming on board, with renegotiation of contracts, and consideration between union representatives and their membership and the government.
Thank you. Mr. Blake?
Thank you. I think it's very important to keep in mind why we have this problem, because it is the failure of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania over the past 13 years to meet its obligation to its pension systems. The actuarial recommended payment into the system, we actually came up $24 billion short in actually paying into the system, which is why we are in the position we're in regarding the unfunded liability, in addition to the market losses that occurred during the recession. Act 120 of 2010, just prior to my arrival in the district, did reset the clock, and it did reset the systems to the extent that it created a much more responsible and I think fair set of pension attributes for our workers, and there are a greater number of Act 120 employees coming into the system now as older workers move out, which is a positive thing. But the responsibility that we have as a state is to meet our payment obligation, which is what Act 120 insists that we do. We have to meet that payment obligation in order to guarantee that our taxpayers aren't hurt anymore. One other point I want to make on the 401k system. If you take the current systems, the current legacy systems, and you essentially extract any new employee out into a 401k, you are no longer paying into the existing systems. 3 actuaries who looked at that plan said that it would double our unfunded liability from $50 billion to close to $90 billion.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to some questions about the environment. The first is, do you support a severance tax on natural gas or other forms of natural resource extraction? Why or why not? And we'll start with Mr. Blake.
Well, since I ran for this office in 2010, I've been on the record that I don't quite understand why we in Pennsylvania, with the gas play, the Marcellus gas play, do not have a tax on the volume of natural gas extracted from this state. I think it's an affront to our citizens that we do not, because every other gas play in the nation does. So I do support the levying of a severance tax. I do believe that we will take this up in the next legislative session, and I will support it. I think in order for it to happen, the current, by the way, the current tax that we put on is basically referred to as an impact fee levied at the county level. So Pennsylvania's citizens are only being compensated by the number of holes drilled, not by the volume of gas that's actually being extracted. So that the effective tax rate of the current levy is about 1.5%, which is far less than any other state in the nation that has a gas play. I would like to see us keep the 1.5% where it is, insofar as that it drives most of the money back to those areas that are most seriously affected by drilling. But we really should add another 3.5% to get it to be about 5% to drive additional money into, for instance, public education.
Thank you. Mr. Albert?
The companies currently utilizing the environment of Pennsylvania for drilling purposes pay a considerable impact fee tax when they begin their wells. The problem, among other things, is that Pennsylvania has the highest corporate income tax in the country, 29%. We have to lower that tax rate, close the Delaware loopholes, expand the base, take a look at the production that the oil and gas companies are currently utilizing in the Commonwealth, and then decide if there's a need for further taxation. What my opponent did not point out is that while most of these impact fees go to the areas where they are currently drilling, every city in the Commonwealth gets a little piece of the pie. And while it's important to realize that these counties that currently are utilizing this impact fee have based their budgets upon this, who's going to make up the difference?
Thank you. Yes, this will be your second of the 3 rebuttals, Mr.
Just
Blake.
a quick comment. I want it to be on the record that I have actually introduced legislation to close the Delaware loophole and reduce the corporate net income tax from 9.9% down to 6.9% over 5 years. The second thing I do want to say is that although we do have the highest corporate net income tax in the country at 9.9%, only about 30% of our corporations pay it.
Thank you. We'll move on to talk a little bit about landfills. A local landfill company has submitted an application to the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection to expand upward to create a mountain of over 100 million tons of garbage. Engineering studies supporting the project were submitted by a firm chosen by the applicant. DEP has questioned the structural integrity of the project, specifically whether there is a risk of the weight of the structure causing collapse of underground mine voids. Despite the massive scale of the proposed project, DEP claims that it has no authority to select a conflict-free engineering firm or to set criteria for the selection of one. So the question is, should the legislature amend the Solid Waste Management Act to give the DEP the authority it needs to ensure that there is no conflict or appearance of conflict in the technical aspects of the application and environmental review processes? And please explain your answer. And we'll start with Mr. Albert.
Well, I think this goes back to your original question when we started this evening regarding integrity and ethics within the individuals and the government. The fact that the DEP has to operate under certain rules and regulations, and the legislature has oversight, is certainly worth looking at. However, the DEP has an obligation to make their concerns known to the legislature, ask for assistance, and the legislature likewise has an obligation to take a look at the problem and decide if it needs further legislation, does it need further study, and how should the issue be resolved. In the case that you pointed out with regard to a local landfill and what they're doing, and they picked the company to explain and define their position on why they should have it, maybe that's an issue another agency, for example, the Attorney General, needs to look at.
Thank you. Mr. Blake?
Colonel Albert's correct on this, because I think the issue of conflict of interest is one we ought to be legislating to guarantee we can avoid. I had a similar circumstance, an analogy, if you will, in the situation of the debt that was incurred in Harrisburg, where an authority member actually was working for one of the firms that was, working on the facility that was going to be supported by the debt. So anytime a conflict of interest situation comes up like that, it might require legislative correction. And I agree that that's something we should do. DEP is, and I have the good fortune of being on the Appropriations Committee in the Senate. It allows me to interview every cabinet secretary. The DEP secretaries have come before me. We do quiz them as to whether or not they have the appropriate tools at their disposal to guarantee the protection of our environment, and that they have the appropriate regulatory control over the decisions that they're responsible to make. And I will be watching very closely what goes on with respect to this landfill in Lackawanna County.
Thank you. And while I appreciate your turning to me when you're answering your questions, feel free to pay attention more to the audience. You can ignore me. I'll just ask the questions. Another question in terms of the environment, and this one Mr. Blake will answer first. Methane leakage associated with natural gas drilling is harming air quality and threatens to undo the potential climate benefits of using natural gas in place of other fossil fuels. Earlier this year, Colorado adopted rules crafted by a coalition of energy companies and environmental groups that require oil and gas companies to use available technologies to reduce methane emissions and other air pollution from their operations. Other gas-producing states, including Ohio, have begun to consider regulations based on the Colorado model. Realizing that Pennsylvania is one of the nation's largest and fastest-growing natural gas producers, if elected or re-elected, would you support development of new rules that would require natural gas companies to employ cost-effective technologies and practices to reduce methane emissions? And again, please explain your answer. And we start with Mr. Blake.
I do support it. I had a chance to get a glimpse of the Colorado model a little bit. We spoke about it in our caucus. It would behoove us to take best practices from other states that have the environmental benefits that the Colorado model has proven and replicate them here. It would be irresponsible for us to ignore this issue insofar as if the gas industry, which is the relatively cleaner fossil fuel as far as emissions are concerned, if the benefits to be accrued from the growth in that industry are diminished or undermined, if you will, by the failure of us to enforce collection of methane at the sites. So I would support us instituting the Colorado model here in Pennsylvania.
Thank you. Mr. Albert?
The Colorado model is a standard apparently being adopted nationwide. And it brings us to the problem of education and the training of appropriate individuals in the future to join the industry. And I don't believe any responsible producer wants to endanger the environment, its policyholders, so to speak. Anybody aside from making a profit, they're interested in protecting the environment, protecting the safety of their workers, protecting the safety of the individuals who utilize them. And we have an obligation as a Commonwealth to make sure, first of all, that our agencies are properly funded, DEP people know what they're doing, they're properly trained, and it comes back to proper funding for educational purposes that translates into economic growth and economic funding and spending responsibly by the part of producers and consumers.
Thank you. We're going to move on to some questions dealing with distressed municipalities. And we'll start this with Mr. Albert. House Bill 1773 to overhaul the Act 47 was approved this month and sent to the governor for his signing. As reported in the Times Tribune, the changes to Act 47 would amend the recovery program for fiscally distressed cities and give them new tax options. Cities would be able to remain under the distressed city law for only 5 years rather than indefinitely. After that, they would face a mandated recovery plan. The changes would allow distressed municipal governments to increase their municipal service taxes on all workers within the city, resident and non-resident. The new changes do not provide help to cities to deal with systematic problems such as a diminished urban tax base, a city's disproportional burden of essential services to the wider geographic area, and inadequately funded municipal pension plans. So the question is, do you feel this legislation is adequate to help distressed cities in Northeast Pennsylvania? Please explain your answer and describe what else you feel is the future role of Harrisburg to support cities. So I know that's a two-part question. So do you feel this legislation is adequate to help the cities here in Northeast Pennsylvania? And describe what else you feel is the future role for the state capital to support the cities. And we begin with Mr. Albert.
Well, I think when you look at Act 47, for example, Scranton, as a Class 2A city, has taken advantage of this position for over 20 years. Time has been spent utilizing the system to avoid trying to get out of it, negotiating bad contracts, exclusively bad leadership and responsibility on the part of the elected officials, and the people to blame, not so much the elected officials, but you, the voters, who fail to go out, elect proper officials, adequate officials, good officials, and demand responsibility from your elected officials. The fact that the legislature finally took action to try to amend the situation is to their credit. Whether it's enough, I don't know.
Thank you. Mr. Blake?
The Act 47 reform, House Bill 1773, was a 3-year process of bicameral, bipartisan negotiation. It is certainly not perfect. Almost no legislation is. But I do believe it was the first chance we can thoughtfully retool the relationship between the Commonwealth and our distressed communities. It is, I believe, a good piece of legislation. There are a lot of things it does not contain, and that's because in the legislative process we weren't going to be dealing with all of the structural issues that affect every city, but we were going to be dealing with the relationship that the state has with those communities that are distressed. The Act does codify the early intervention program, and that's a good thing because it could keep cities from getting into Act 47. And the Act also does have a timeline that forces some tough decisions in the hopes that they can't linger there too long. So it is good, but it is not sufficient. It is not all that we need to do, which is why I've been fighting to get the community revitalization, the CRIZ zone for the city of Scranton, which is why I believe we should be investing in our core business districts, which is why I believe we should be compensating our cities in some way for the extensive amount of tax-exempt property that they have. My friend Bob Freeman from the House, who is part of the Act 47 reform effort, has suggested legislation to try to compensate our cities for the extent of tax-exempt property that they have. But at the end of the day, while Act 47 and this particular reform is a good measure, it is only one step in the process. We need to do more for our small cities. We need to do more for the city of Scranton.
Thank you. Related to Act 47 to help distressed cities is legislation to overhaul Act 111, Act 111 collective bargaining process for police and firefighters. Public unions do not want to change the current process, while local government officials say taxpayers can no longer afford the costs of arbitration awards under the current terms of Act 111. The basic objective of reform bills is to give local governments more leverage in the arbitration process and to open the process to the public. Bills have included provisions to have governments and unions share the costs of the arbitration process, require evidentiary hearings to be public, exclude post-retirement health care and pension from being subjects of collective bargaining, and require arbitrators to analyze the impact of an arbitration award on a municipality's finances and its ability to pay the award. The question, and this time we'll start with Mr. Blake, is what is your position on the proposed reforms to the collective bargaining process?
Well, I will say this. I work with Senator Eichelberger. I know he has a bill. I believe it does go too far relative to the reform for Act 111. There is a perception out there that the Act 111 process that currently exists does not take into consideration the fiscal health of the community with respect to that negotiation. I think that's a flawed perception. I do believe that the arbitration procedure does, in some measure, take into consideration the fiscal health of the community. I'm willing to consider some reforms on this, but I think what has been suggested thus far in Senator Eichelberger's bill, I would not support. I think it is too draconian a change.
Thank you. Mr. Albert?
I think, as I said before, it all comes back to responsible legislation, responsible leadership, and consolidation, working together, and attempting to improve the overall situation for everybody concerned. In this particular case, when you have unions dictating, again, special interest versus the government who's putting their position on the line, there's no compromise. It's one or the other. Life is a compromise, and it must be held forth throughout legislation. And again, it comes back to you, the voters, getting out and voting in responsible officials, and those who are members of unions, taking your leaders to task to do what's responsible, not necessarily what's great for you. Look at the total picture. People are not doing that.
Thank you. Move on to some topics relevant to education. And we'll start with Mr. Albert on this question. School districts deal with the threat of teacher strikes every year. Last best offer binding arbitration has been suggested as a means to achieve contracts that are fair to teachers and taxpayers. The question is, should lawmakers take action to outlaw strikes in favor of last best offer binding arbitration or some other alternative? And please explain your answer. Mr. Albert.
Well, that's very interesting the way you asked that. Pennsylvania rates in the top 10 in the country in two specific areas. Number 5 in public corruption, and number 1 in teacher strikes. There are over 500 school districts in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Perhaps that's too many. The legislature must take a good hard look at how legislation is passed regarding school contracts, teacher strikes, and whether or not they should be outlawed. They are in other states. Pennsylvania is only one of 11 states that permits teacher strikes.
Thank you. Mr. Blake?
At the core of your question is really, again, the earlier comments I had about funding. If school districts are dealing with extraordinary increases in their health care costs, the pressure of their pension, these negotiations become extraordinarily difficult, and they're in a vice in terms of trying to provide some dignity. I think we need to be careful about the collective bargaining rights of our employees. I believe that there are some steps we probably could take relative to if a strike occurs that not only does the math club not meet, but maybe the football team doesn't play either. I think that would be a simple thing that could create some incentive for settlement. So there are some things I think that we can do short of an outright ban. But these are very disruptive, I understand it, and I wish that we could be in a better position relative to, for instance, a statewide health care plan for teachers, which I think could save, it was slated to save upwards of $600 million, and that was a report that was done probably 10 years ago. If you ask any business administrator or anyone that's negotiating with teachers, the biggest and most difficult factor that they deal with is health care, and we should try to help them on that front.
Thank you.
I would like to comment
Okay, so this is your
with regard to that.
your second rebuttal?
Specifically, as Senator Blake pointed out, there has been talk about a statewide health care plan for teachers. Currently, for those involved in the healthcare field and industry, there's only 3 carriers under the current national health care law, commonly called Obamacare, that you can buy health insurance from in the Commonwealth. And one of those carriers will only write in Philadelphia. Here in the 22nd Congressional District, you can only get health care from 2 carriers, Geisinger and Blue Cross, special interests that have special interests they don't want to see jeopardized.
Thank you. Continuing with education, in polls, education ranks as one of voters' top concerns. Reform proposals directed at the classroom include tenure reform and educational standards reform. What legislation do you feel should be enacted at the state level to improve public education in the classrooms here in Pennsylvania? And we'll begin with Mr. Blake.
I think the first thing we should be doing is listening to our teachers. I think we've learned a little bit about what teaching to the test has done to our public education system, and I think that there's been an erosion to some extent in the quality of the experience. Again, I think we need to listen to the teachers a little bit about how we can improve that experience. I've dedicated the past 4 years of my tenure in the Senate to trying to focus on career-focused education, getting kids in our school earlier involved in the connection and the spark, if you will, between what they're learning and the careers of the future. We've had a great few summits, E2 summits I call them, that we've done over the past couple of years. We'll be doing another one. It could require some legislative intervention to deal with the manner in which we connect industry to our schools, meaning getting teachers into the business place, getting our business leaders into the schools in order to create a better opportunity for a career path for our students. And I think that might be something we can legislate some improvement around.
Thank you. Mr. Albert?
I think, first of all, with regard to education, you've got to take a look at the fact that there's a program called Common Core, which is a total disaster with regard to education. It's fomented out of Washington, run by bureaucrats in the most useless government agency, the Department of Education, which should be abolished, and dictates to the states what they have to do with regard to education. I believe in school choice. I believe it's a parent's right. I think the funding should follow the child. If necessary, vouchers should be employed. There should be competitive between schools. You should compete for the students the same way schools compete for athletes. The problem is that the Common Core used for education, states are dropping out of it left and right. The government's wrangling it. You want money, you follow the program. There's no reason in 2 areas, math and English, that it's a total disaster.
Thank you. What can the lawmakers in Harrisburg do directly or indirectly to encourage economic development through job creation in the state? And we'll start with Mr. Albert on this one.
Well, I think with regard to economic development in the state, I think it's important to realize, let's talk specifically about the 22nd Senatorial District. Here in northeastern Pennsylvania, we have the highest unemployment rate in the Commonwealth. It's a disgrace. With the attributes we have, the educational facilities we have, the transportation system we have, there is no excuse for the unemployment rate we have here in northeastern Pennsylvania. Women are not being paid for the jobs they do. There's inequality with regard to work, education, and the benefits that come from that. So we have to take the bull by the horns and decide whether we, as we discussed earlier, lower the corporate tax rate, close the Delaware loophole, expand the base, and try to encourage businesses to come into Pennsylvania. Why should a company come to Pennsylvania to build a product or manufacture a good or sell a service when they can do it cheaper elsewhere? We have to have economic development zones, and we have to have programs that attract companies to come to Pennsylvania.
Thank you. Mr. Blake?
Well, I think a couple of things that I need to say about this. First of all, in the past 4 years under this gubernatorial administration, there's been a disinvestment in the Commonwealth. We've gone from 8th in job growth to 50th, as was reported by the U.S. Department of Commerce this past week. And I agree with my opponent here on the issues of unemployment and the intractable unemployment that has really vexed northeastern Pennsylvania. It's been the most difficult thing for me is to be in rooms with very qualified, very educated people who are still out of work. We went from about $500 million in a general fund budget at the Department of Community and Economic Development down to $214 million, about a 40% cut. We took the $500 million redevelopment assistance capital program that leverages about $3 for every one we invest from $500 million down to $125 million under this administration. In the lowest interest rate environment over the past 4 years, we could have been investing in our people, investing in our cities, and we have failed to do so. So the state's not going to be the solution to this problem by virtue of state taxpayer money, but there is a role that we can play in partnership with the business community that could drive economic growth. And there are things that I have been trying to do over the past 4 years in the Senate to essentially focus on the state's role in guaranteeing that investment and that job growth, and most of that could be seen at my website.
Thank you. I think this will probably be the last question, and this is a topic that's of interest to the League of Women Voters and should be of interest to all voters in the state. Most Pennsylvanians believe that they already are permitted to register to vote online. They're not. 24 states do permit voters to register online. Online voter registration has proven to provide major cost savings to state and county election agencies, made voter registration data more secure and accurate, increased agency efficiency, and made it easier for voters to register and update their registration. Again, we're talking about online voter registration, not online voting. The question is, and we'll start with Mr. Blake, do you support allowing online voter registration, and if so, will you introduce legislation to make the change? If you do not support it, why not?
I do support it. I actually am a co-sponsor of Senator Lloyd Smucker's bill that would allow and in fact permit online voter registration, so I'm on the record in support of this. Anything that we can do to make it easier for our citizens to vote, we ought to pursue with vigor.
Thank you. Mr. Albert?
I have no problem with online voter registration. I want to know how it's going to be secure, how it's going to be produced when they show up to vote, what the next step is going to be, how it's going to be regulated, how signatures are going to be verified, along with supporting data. The problem is that those of us who have served realize the virtue of voting in a democracy. The problem is you, the public, who don't feel it's worth your effort to get out and vote on November 4th or any other election. I'm sure my opponent would agree. The issue, as we both stated earlier, integrity and ethics depends upon you, the voter, getting out and exercising that right that those of us who served and died for to give you that opportunity.
Thank you. With that, what I'd like to do is turn to closing statements. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to make a closing statement. Again, we did a drawing at the beginning, and Mr. Blake will be the first to provide his closing statement. This is the time, once Mr. Blake is done, if you feel you'd like to clap or applause, you can, and the same thing after Mr. Albert is done. Mr. Blake.
Well, again, thank you to Dr. Harris, to the University of Scranton, to the League of Women Voters, and thank you to my opponent, Colonel Albert. I basically would like to close with the fact that I've kept my promise to be accessible and responsive and accountable to the people I represent. I have worked very hard for 4 years to represent the sensibility of the people I represent in northeastern Pennsylvania, and every time I take a vote, whether it's on the floor or in committee, I'm not thinking about me, I'm thinking about you. And I have been an effective legislator. I have introduced or caused to be introduced probably 24 pieces of legislation that have actually been signed into law by this governor. And as a minority Democrat in a minority caucus in my first term in the Senate, I think my record is rather speaks for itself. I've been very, very good at negotiating fair and good public policy with my Republican colleagues. A lot of what I've accomplished in my first term has been bipartisan work with my Republican colleagues. And there's plenty of examples of that, including the Military Installations and Base Development Caucus that I established with Senator Rich Alloway, Innovate in PA, which I worked with John Gordner from Columbia County, and there's numerous other examples. I've been able to, because of my past experience, 30 years of a career prior to entering the Senate, and a number of years in the executive branch, I understand state government well enough to know how to deliver a fair share of the state's investment back to the 22nd District, and I have been a very, very strong advocate, a tireless advocate, in trying to make sure that the people of the 22nd District benefit from new state investment, and that has been my track record. So I really, at this point, feel I've worked very, very hard for 4 years. I want very much to continue that hard work on behalf of the people of the 22nd District, and I welcome your support to continue to serve you as your state senator.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. Mr. Albert?
I thank the League of Women Voters, the university, and you, Dr. Harris, for this opportunity to address the voters of the 22nd District. The issue in this election is leadership, responsible leadership, and who can get the job done. Come November, whether or not I am elected to serve as your state senator, the state Senate will be controlled by the Republicans. My opponent has had 4 years to do something for northeastern Pennsylvania. He's had over 20 years' experience in the state running perhaps one of the most important state agencies, economic development. And yet, northeastern Pennsylvania and the 22nd District lags behind the rest of the Commonwealth. It's you, the people, who have to make the decision on what you want your future to be. An individual with demonstrated leadership who is willing to go to Harrisburg as part of the majority, or return an incumbent who will return to Harrisburg as a member of the minority. You have that power to make that decision, and I hope, regardless, you will all get out and vote on Tuesday, November 4th. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Albert. On behalf of the League of Women Voters, I thank you for being here this evening. We hope that you have found this evening's debate educational and useful as you think about how you'll be voting on Election Day, and we do want to remind you that November 4th is Election Day, so please remember to vote. Thank you.